Chops Bill. The question is, said bill be now read a first time. As many as are of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it.
Stockton. My lords, it is a strange phenomenon which I have now twice witnessed in my life, that in the closing period of any long and devastating war, when the nation has lost hundreds of thousands of its finest young men by death or mutilation, and squandered vast masses of its treasure, there is a general opinion covering all classes and degrees that the days of peace must inevitably bring about a period of unexampled wealth and prosperity. After the First War, the illusion did not last long. The Great Depression began about 1922 and continued until 1938, when rearmament began to have its effect. During all those years, Britain was not, alas, a land fit for heroes. It was demoralized and depressed by the longest and greatest industrial collapse in our history up to that date, produced unemployment on a prodigious scale, more than even today. And since the methods of relief were primitive and parsimonious, the result has left a deep mark in the memory of working class tradition. I was particularly affected by it naturally, since I was a member for a constituency of the northeast of England, particularly affected. After the Second War, we were more fortunate. For although naturally during the first 4 or 5 years there were great shortages of all needs such as clothing, heating, housing, and food, there was little or no unemployment. And as gradually these shortages became remedied, it became possible to put into effect that great scheme of social reform which was initiated in the closing years of the Great War Coalition under Lord Wilton by the driving effort of Sir William Beveridge. Those schemes, first Labour governments and then successively Conservative governments, carried into effect. And we were able to finance them because of the favorable balance of trade and the favorable state of our economy. This was due partly to good fortune. British industry made a fairly rapid readjustment from war production to peace production. It had always prudently kept, even during the war, part of its effort for what were called exports. Other countries, swept by the devastation of war, right through the whole of Europe, indeed almost throughout the whole world, were desperately short of goods and services. Therefore, almost anything that could be made could be sold. And British industry enjoyed a boom, sometimes even an excessive boom that had to be that needed not so much the spur as the curb. But budgets were balanced, taxation was gradually reduced, interest rates varied between 4 and 5%. The gold exchange system, initiated by the Bretton Woods scheme, stood up well to its pressures. And for nearly 30 years, this happy situation lasted. It was only in the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, that clouds began to appear up on the horizon. The older countries of Europe had begun to revive from the pressures and destruction of war. They had the advantage of new industries, new plants, and new traditions. Their productivity was high. And we began to see in the early 70s our goods becoming more and more replaced by foreign manufactured goods in what had been our overseas markets. And even our own home market invaded. The great and crashing blow to the whole Western economic structure came, of course, in 1974 with the sudden and dramatic rise in the price of oil. This had three devastating effects. First, it enormously increased the cost of production of goods at home and in all countries in Western Europe. Secondly, since these goods could not be sold at prices which the new and emerging countries could afford to pay, the industries concerned became depressed. And consequently, thirdly, the emerging countries, which largely depend upon the export of raw materials, found the demand and price of these consequently falling. Finally, the enormous sums of money, of floating money, uninvested money, produced by this huge demand of the Gulf countries, produced a great cloud that moved uneasily about the capitals of the world, disturbing the monetary systems, upsetting the economies, destroying the general structure, and leading to higher and higher rates of interest. So various governments, in all investor faith, faced with these difficulties, adopted policies which are now familiar to us. Would the old Keynesian policies be applicable? Could the creation of more credit and of more money in the market stimulate the industries which were beginning to decline? That was tried in a major and minor degree. Could special schemes of government employment on work organized and paid for by the government direct be of use to the unemployed? That was tried. But it will be remembered the results of both these was unsatisfactory. The pressure upon the sterling, upon the exchanges, became greater and greater, since under these plans, prices rose, wages rose, without any corresponding increase in productivity. Both these are, as I understand, still the plans of two of the great parties of state. Finally, towards the Labour government, which had bravely striven to meet this storm and had courageously carried out an attempt to control both prices and wages, collapsed, and the present government took office at a period of grave crisis. It must never be forgotten to their credit that they dealt with this situation courageously and if only by conventional means, at any rate for the time successfully. Money rates were raised to 18%, if I remember right. Money and credit became more and more difficult to get upon the market. Many great firms fell out of business under this pressure. Others just survived. But in the long run, in the ensuing years, these conventional methods of deflation at least produced some order into the economy and into the general industrial system. They used a combination of two methods. First, the general deflation. Secondly, the saving on every possible account, both in public and local government expenditure. Cuts were made or increases reduced in the great social services. But now, after 5 or 6 years, that policy becomes rather barren. In the early days, there was always a little fat to be scraped off. But as the years pass, it becomes more and more difficult to achieve economies in government expenditure without, in defense, endangering the national security, or in the great level of social services which we have come to call the welfare state, and which is now demanded by the whole people. It becomes more and more difficult. We put on a little charge here or there on some bit of medicine, or you can make a little deduction here and there, but it becomes less and less. And indeed, the truth is that the demands for growth cannot forever be resisted. We have cut the health service. We have cut the educational services to a dangerous extent. We cannot prevent the increasing charge in the future on pensions and old age. A large number of old gentlemen, of whom I and other of your lordships are some of the worst offenders, insist on living to this absurd old age when nothing can stop them. And when our statisticians look at the figures of what pensions will cost us in the next 10 or 20 years, they hesitate even to publish them. Therefore, that method is almost coming to an end, and indeed must soon be reversed. Still we remain. What is the policy? I venture very humbly to suggest that the leaders of all the parties and the economists on all sides have nearly failed to grasp the real issue. What we are worried about is the gap between what we are spending and what we are earning. Every year we are earning less than we are spending. And much as we try and cut our expenditure, that remains true. There is no cure for this, my lords, by savings. There is no cure for it of any kind, except by the increase in real wealth. That is the only method open to us. No tinkering with currencies or monetary systems will have any lasting effect. No great schemes of public employment will be more than just alleviations, short term. Complete new approach is needed to the problem with which we are confronted. At present, this gap is being met in two ways. First, by the sale of national assets onto the market, bringing in large sums of money which help to support the budget of each year. When I ventured to criticize the other day this system, I was, I'm afraid, misunderstood. As a conservative, I'm naturally in favor of returning into private ownership and private management all those means of production and distribution which are now controlled by state capitalism. I'm sure they will be more efficient. What I ventured to question was the using of these huge sums as if they were income. I know now, I've learnt now from the letters I received that I'm quite out of date. Modern economists have decided there is no difference between capital and income. I'm not so sure. In my younger days, I and perhaps others of your lordships had friends, good friends, very good fellows indeed too, who failed to make this distinction. For a few years, everything went on very well. And then at last the crash came, and they were forced to retire either some dingy lodging house in Boulogne, or the estate were larger and the trustees more generous, to a decent accommodation at Baden-Baden. What is the other thing that has helped to bridge this huge gap? Why, my lords, this extraordinary windfall that has come to us. We could never hope for or dreamed of. The coming of the North Sea oil. This country, which was living for years upon the product of the countries in the Persian Gulf, has suddenly become a great oil producer itself. And here, both the government and the industry are to be congratulated on the skill and rapidity by which these new resources have been developed. But these immense sums, they are that fill the gap. Many of your lordships will have read the Aldington report. The committee of your lordships' houses have produced a very remarkable document. And if they study this, they will see that should either of these supports fail, the sale of capital assets, which is bound to grow smaller, or by some means or other the reduction of the oil revenues, we should indeed be in great difficulty, almost collapse. Meanwhile, hardly known, understood, or even realized by the mass of our people, there's been taking place a complete new revolution of the world, equivalent to and even greater than the industrial revolutions of which we read. Today, it is not the coal and the steam engine, it is not oil and the motor engine, it is the silicon chip, the robot, the fully automated plant. This extraordinary process has been going on hardly with our own knowledge in the East and the West. In the Far East with remarkable rapidity. Japan, where it has been brought about by the application of scientific knowledge, not by means, as many people think, of laissez-faire or a new kind of communism, but by an active partnership between a very strongly organized government and a highly organized industry. In the United States, where almost equal progress is being made, they have to their advantage the tradition of being to some extent still a pioneer people, where the movements of men and women in large numbers are still possible and expected, where new and small industries easily start and are given the maximum of support. And here I must pay tribute to what this government has tried to do for small industry here. But where there's nothing strange or new about the development of whole new areas and new systems. At any rate, in this development, we have fallen gravely behind. Of course, there are many modern, highly well-managed, highly competent firms that are operating this new technique. But it has come into something which is wholly different in kind from anything we have known before. So the new technology to which I try to call attention in this debate is a matter which many of my noble friends have given deep study to, and upon which already important reports have been published by your Lordship's House. There is no doubt at all in my mind that the only possible way of making an increase in real wealth, that is by true productivity, that is by the creation of goods and services at prices that will command the foreign markets and regain our own, can only be brought about by the increasing adoption of the new technology. The old systems are out of date, and they cannot be revived. Of course, to say this is easy, to achieve it vastly difficult. When the first industrial revolution began 150 years ago, it brought in its train not only a great increase of wealth, but alas, at the same time, great trouble and suffering. It allowed to be destroyed, without making any attempt to replace it, the great system of rural industry, which had for centuries depended upon the product of the spinning wheel and the loom from the village, from the cottage home. It was followed by a rush of rural population to work in factories, ill-devised, ill-lit, and live in mean, jerry-built houses, hastily put together in sprawling streets surrounding the new factories that sprung into existence. All this brought with an infinity of trouble and sorrow. We cannot allow that. Perhaps it was understandable, since we had no experience, men of the time had no experience of anything on that scale. We cannot allow that to happen again. When, as is necessary, the new system takes control, it must be by the most careful consideration, by the most careful and sympathetic planning. It will alter perhaps the whole concept of industrial life. I think the great factories may be a thing of the past, and the new methods used in smaller institutions. If so, that will affect town and country planning and all kinds of other problems we have. It seems to me more than likely that the very expensive, capital-intensive plant, which pays out money in interest and sinking fund on its initial cost all the time, day after day, week after week, shall not, as now, work only 7.5 to 8 hours a day for perhaps 5 days in the week or 220 days in the year, but that this plant shall have to operate as in the industries that depend on the hot metal, where the method requires it, upon almost continuous process of working. The machine should, in my view, work longer and the men and women less. There will have to be organized shorter hours, more shifts, all kinds of new combinations and organizations of labor. There will have to be retraining of operatives upon a prodigious scale, which experience both in Japan and America shows to be both feasible and effective. There will have to be far greater expenditure upon universities and research. It's an illusion to believe that we can spend money on what is called applied research. Applied research has no existence except from pure research, which is the spring and fountain. And if we allow that source to dry up, gradually the applied research will become fossilized. My lords, the changes that will have to take place, I can hardly imagine. Completely different as the world that Mr. H.G. Wells used to draw in his early scientific novels, as from the world as we see it today. And yet, my Lord, we cannot resist it. If we try to, we just go slowly back and sink like a great galleon in the seas, living only in our past glory and not in our present authority and power. To achieve this, my lords, will require the greatest possible combination of all our people in a single effort. It needs a policy not of confrontation, but of cooperation in every field, in the workshop, between the managers of industry and the proprietors of money, between the managers of industry and the trade unions representing labor, in working out a whole new system of life, sometimes to spread work as much as possible, sometimes to create new work. In the short run, we must accept the fact that these new methods, being capital intensive rather than labor intensive, will produce not more unemployment but less. On the other hand, if real wealth is produced, then that in its turn, as all wealth does, produce the corresponding prosperity of industries and services which are ranged round the great production systems. These will be all sorts of services feeding the wishes, the lives, the hopes, the ambitions, the energy, the health of our people. They will concentrate on great new concepts of education and development, of music and art, and of all sorts of new aspects of life that are now only known to the comparatively few. My lords, this is not within it is within our grasp, difficult as it may be. It is one of the few advantages of being removed from all contact with affairs, and in my infirmity, particularly my blindness, from any close knowledge of moving events. One is forced to spend much time in reflection. I've thought much and instructed myself, as well as my friends and colleagues have been able to do, on the issue involved. This is something as new and perhaps more revolutionary than the Industrial Revolution of 1840. It cannot be stopped. It is like the tide coming in. it will sweep forward. If, on the other hand, we accept its inevitability, and in all parts of our life, in industry, in trade, in commerce, in finance, everywhere, work together to solve the ensuing problems. If we can do so with something of the spirit that animated our country through 2 long and terrible wars, well, when conscious that we'd had great political disputes before the war and would revert to them again, we were yet, for what we called for the period, united in a single purpose. If we can do that, my lords, we shall have every hope of seeing our country regaining its place in strength and authority throughout the world. Yeah.